The great hall of Neutral Moon Court held two kinds of silence that morning. There was the silence of the galleries, packed with pack representatives, temple scholars, and common wolves who had traveled for days to stand in a room where, by ancient law, no king's guard could stand between them and the proceedings. And there was the silence of Marcus himself, standing on the raised platform where the alpha crown still rested on his head, surrounded by soldiers whose hands had moved to their weapons and then stopped. Eveline stood at the petitioner's floor. She wore no armor, she carried no sword. In front of her on the long oak table, a birth ledger, a sealed cloth that smelled of ancient royal lineage, sworn testimonies, petition stones from 7-pack territories, and records copied and countersigned, and held in 12 separate locations so that no single fire could touch them all. Marcus's voice was controlled when he gave the order. He named her a threat to the crown. He called her a traitor to Aurelthorn. He told his soldiers to arrest her. No one moved, not because they feared Eveline, because 7 alphas had already placed their hands on the oath stones and spoken the words that unwound 20 years of compelled loyalty. A general stepped forward, not toward Eveline but toward Marcus, and said, "My king, I cannot enforce a command the law no longer recognizes." Marcus looked at Eveline across the distance of the hall. "You came to take my throne," she said. "No, I came to prove it was never yours." 1 year earlier, she had been a border clerk who did not yet know her own name. She had been Eveline Ash for as long as she could remember a name that belonged to the family who had taken her in, the family of record keepers, who worked in the dispute office at the edge of the Eastern Territories where Aurelthorn's writ ran thin. And people came with their problems written on folded papers that had been passed between hands so many times the ink had faded. She knew the work. She knew what it meant when a family's land record disappeared from the archive and the appeal was denied, and the clerk behind the counter explained, with the practiced patience of someone who had said it many times, that without the original seal, there was nothing to be done. She had watched a farmer lose 3 generations of land because a noble steward had misfiled the boundary document, and the royal archive had sided with the noble's copy. She had watched a pack's tribute records vanish the week before a collection dispute went to tribunal. She had learned, in the particular way that people who work with paper learn things, that truth required structure to survive. A fact without a record was a rumor. A record without protection was a target. The Royal Bloodmark appeared the night of her 20th birthday. Under the full moon, in the cold of the border winter, it rose on the inside of her wrist, not like a bruise, not like a burn, but like something surfacing from beneath the skin. Silver bright and shaped in the old royal lines pattern that she recognized from the illustrated histories, because she had always read anything available. Her foster mother was waiting when she came inside. The woman had aged since Eveline had last looked at her carefully, and she looked older still now, and she went to a chest in the back room that Eveline had been told, as a child, held winter things. It held a small cloth bundle, sealed with wax that had cracked with age inside. A strip of birthing cloth that carried a scent. Eveline could not name, but felt in her chest like a word she had heard once and not forgotten. Half a birth ledger, the bottom portion, with a date and a midwife's mark and 1 line in formal court script that confirmed an heir born to the royal line of Aurelthorn. A letter in an unfamiliar hand that said, "Find the midwife called Rowan if the mark ever wakes." And 1 sentence written separately, in different ink, as though added later by someone who wanted to be absolutely sure. If the Mark wakes, the regent lied. Marcus moved quickly, because he always had. Within 2 days, a royal proclamation declared that a false claimant was being sponsored by the rebel pack of Ravenscar. Within the week, Princess Seraphine was formally invested as Crown Heir in a ceremony that every noble house attended, and most pack representatives were required to witness. And Eveline Ash was named an enemy of the crown, and hunted under that name for the first time, which was, she thought, the only honest thing that had happened in a very long time. Ravenscar was 3 days' travel north, through forest that did not want to be crossed in autumn. Alpha Naren met her at the tree line with 6 warriors, which she understood was both welcome and assessment. He was not a subtle man. He told her directly that Ravenscar had been waiting for a claimant for 11 years, and that if she was real, they would stand behind her, and if she was false, they would hand her to Marcus themselves, because they were not interested in martyrdom. His Luna Thalia was quieter. She fed Eveline soup at the long table in the pack hall, while Naren talked about troop positions and supply lines and the 7 other packs who had sent word that they were watching Ravenscar's next move. Eveline listened to Naren with one part of her attention. She watched Thalia with the other. When Naren finished, Thalia said, "Do not ask us to die for your crown. Ask us to stand for a law that will protect us after you wear it." The room was quieter after that. Cassian Vale arrived the following morning, a scholar of Crown law who had been dismissed from the royal court 4 years earlier for submitting a formal objection to Marcus's sealing of the succession archive. He had a scholar's face and a soldier's wariness, and he was the first person to look at Eveline's evidence without telling her what he hoped to find in it. He spread her documents on the table and went through them one by one. He told her that what she had was a beginning, not a case. He explained Crown Oath, that the pack oaths were pledged not to Marcus as a person but to the lawful crown, and that if the crown's lawfulness could be proven false in the proper venue, the oaths became void without any wolf needing to raise a hand against their sworn lord. He explained Neutral Moon Court, the ancient tribunal that existed outside royal authority, the only legal body in Aurelthorn that could hear a succession dispute, and the only place where the pack representatives had standing equal to the crown. He explained why Marcus had spent 20 years making sure that court was never convened. Then he told her what she would need to open it. She spent the following weeks doing what she had spent her whole life doing in the dispute office. Except that now, the stakes were not a farmer's field, but the question of who had the right to hold an entire kingdom. She had spent years watching people lose their claims, not because they were wrong, but because they had not understood the mechanism well enough to protect themselves inside it. She was not going to make that mistake with the largest claim she would ever bring. Cassian was a methodical teacher. He did not flatter her progress, and he did not soften the parts she found frustrating. When she made an error in legal reasoning, he named it. When her argument had a gap, he put his finger on the gap and waited for her to fill it. She found herself thinking that this was what the education she had not received might have felt like, the kind that assumed the student was capable of rigor. She learned the Crown Oath language until she could recite it in her sleep. She studied the Neutral Moon Court protocols until she understood not just the rules, but the reasons behind them. She mapped the packs that Marcus had punished for asking questions, the pack lands that had been seized, the tribute agreements that had been altered, the oath ceremonies that records showed had been conducted under conditions that looked, from a legal standpoint, more like compulsion than consent. The law was not a sword. Cassian said it to her once, late in the evening when she had been awake for too long and was beginning to confuse speed with progress. It is slower, heavier, and harder to hold clean, but it cuts where swords cannot. In the capital, Marcus was not wasting the time Eveline was spending on law books. He understood narratives. He had always understood them better than most people understood weapons. Chancellor Morcant was the mechanism through which that understanding operated. Morcant had held the Royal Archive position for 16 years, which was long enough to understand that the archive was not a record of what had happened. It was a record of what the kingdom agreed had happened. The distinction was everything. A young clerk came to him one evening while he was working late, amending a date in a ledger with the kind of careful ink that matched the surrounding script closely enough that the alteration would not be obvious. The clerk asked what happened to law when the records it was based on had been changed. Morcant set down his pen and said, "A record only matters if the archive agrees it exists." The clerk did not ask again. Seraphine was being prepared for her public role with the care and thoroughness that Marcus applied to everything he considered important. She was not a stupid woman. She had been educated well, too well, perhaps, because the more she learned, the more she found herself noticing the small irregularities that a less careful mind might have overlooked. Servant women who had worked in the palace for decades and who would not meet her eyes. Her own birth records, which, when she examined them across different documents, did not agree on all the details they should have agreed on. A midwife's name in the palace registry that had been crossed out and replaced with a different name. Marcus had told her that her legitimacy was absolute. She had spent a long time believing that, because believing it was easier than the alternative. But she had begun to pull at the thread. The decision to move on Archivist Mael was Eveline's to make, and she made it too fast. Mael had been a junior court archivist who had been quietly collecting evidence for years, a copy of the temple ledger that matched Rowan's account. Records that showed the two halves of the birth ledger had once been one document, correspondence between Marcus and Morcant from the year of the Queen's death. He had sent word that he was ready to turn everything over. Eveline wanted it before Marcus could act. She believed that possessing the full temple ledger would close the case before Marcus had time to build the counter-narrative. She used a messenger who had been recommended rather than verified. She sent Mael a meeting location. She arrived before dawn. The room was dark in the way. Rooms are dark when the person who was supposed to be there is not there and will not be arriving. An oil lamp had been knocked from its hook. The pool of ink from an overturned well had spread across the corner of a desk where papers had clearly been swept off in haste. One page of the temple ledger was on the floor, partially burned, a corner of it still holding the midwife's seal that Rowan had described. Mael was beside the record cabinet. He was still holding a fragment of the royal seal, the kind issued by the seal office, the kind that Morcant's office administered. Eveline stood in that room for a long time before she moved. When she told Cassian, he did not rage. He said, "Evidence does not bleed. Witnesses do," she said. "I thought I was moving evidence. I was moving people." She said it like a sentence she was handing herself as a permanent correction. Cassian let her carry it. He did not take it away from her by telling her it wasn't her fault. It was. Not entirely. But enough that she would carry Mael's name for the rest of whatever she was becoming. She changed her methods. Not because Cassian told her to, but because the room with Mael's body had made one thing completely clear. She could not treat the people around her as pieces on a board, and then ask them to trust her with a kingdom. She built the witness circle over the following month with the same methodical attention she had brought to the border dispute records, except that now she understood she was not just building a system for winning a case. She was building a system that had to protect people in the process of winning it. No witness moved alone. Every person in her network had 2 pack escorts and a secondary contact who could carry their information forward if they were prevented from arriving. Every document was copied 3 times, held in separate locations, and each location was known only to the person responsible for it. No messenger traveled the same route twice. The temple clerks who had been quietly sympathetic were brought into formal protection arrangements, not as assets, but as people who needed to be alive when the court opened. Rowan came last. The old midwife had been living quietly in a border village for 20 years, not hiding exactly, but not making herself known either. She had been carrying the weight of that night in silence for as long as Eveline had been alive. Eveline did not go to her with a list of what she needed. She went to her with 2 Ravenscar guards and a safe house offer, and the information that she was not going to be Rowan's only protection. She told the old woman what the witness circle was. She told her that if Rowan testified and was believed, it would not be because Eveline had placed her alone at a podium and hoped for the best. It would be because the truth had been structured to survive. Rowan wept not from gratitude, from the relief of no longer being the only person who knew what she knew, while Eveline was building that structure. Marcus was working his own plan. He declared Eveline an active threat to pack unity and Ravenscar a destabilizing force. He produced a document through Morcant's office that showed a payment from a foreign trading house to a Ravenscar account, with Eveline's description in the attached note. He told the packs that questioning succession was the first step toward the kind of civil breakdown that had torn apart neighboring kingdoms. He told Seraphine she was the symbol of stability and that her presence at public ceremonies was the most important thing she could do. Eveline watched all of it from the reports that came through the Witness Circle's network, and she did not respond to any of it with anything except a single message, short enough to be read aloud at any pack meeting. Open the court. If I am false, let the law say it where everyone can hear. The message moved through the pack territories faster than Marcus's declarations, because Marcus's declarations required people to trust him. Eveline's challenge required only that they trust the law. Pack petition stones began to arrive at the Neutral Moon Court registry. 1 stone, then 3, then 5. The 6th came from a pack that Marcus had believed was firmly in his circle a border territory that had been quiet for years, and whose quiet, it turned out, had been the quiet of people who had learned that asking questions cost them the answers they needed. The 7th came from a pack that had not sent representatives to the capital in 12 years. Not since their tribute appeal had been quietly buried in Morcant's archive. Not since the clerk who had been handling their case had been transferred to a posting so far from the capital that the appeal had simply run out of time. They had not forgotten. They had been waiting for a venue where forgetting was not required. Neutral Moon Court had to be convened. Seraphine made her decision alone. She had spent 3 weeks with the thread she had been pulling, and she had followed it with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had been given an excellent education, and had, until recently, been applying it entirely to the task of believing in her own legitimacy. She went to the Royal Archive in the hours when Morcant was not there, early morning, when the senior clerks had not yet arrived and the junior staff were occupied with the morning's supply deliveries. She read the documents she had previously been told were sealed for administrative reasons, which was a phrase she had accepted for years, without examining what administrative reasons could possibly justify sealing records about her own birth. 2 versions of her birth date in documents that should have agreed. A name in the maternal registry that no other record confirmed. A financial disbursement to a family whose name did not appear anywhere else in the court records. A letter in Marcus's hand that said, "The girl must be old enough to be believed." A list of servants dismissed in the month after the Queen's death. Dismissed without records of cause, which was unusual because Morcant's office recorded causes for everything. She sat with all of it for a long time. Then she sent a message through a channel she had maintained carefully, precisely because it did not run through Morcant's office. She met Eveline in a small chapel on the edge of the capital, at an hour when both of them had good reasons to be somewhere else. Eveline looked at her and said, "You wore the crown they used to bury me." Seraphine said, "Then let me be the one who takes it off in public." Eveline did not offer forgiveness. She did not have it to give yet, and she was not willing to lie about that. But she accepted the documents Seraphine had brought, and she sat across from the woman who had been shaped from birth into the keystone of Marcus's architecture, and she understood something she had not expected to understand. Seraphine had also been a casualty. She had not been innocent. She had occupied a throne built on Eveline's erasure, and she had done it with enough belief in her own legitimacy to hold the role convincingly. But she had been given that belief by someone who needed her to hold it, and she had not known the cost until she went looking. That did not make her guiltless. It made her something more complicated than an enemy. The neutral moon court convened at first light on a day that had been building for 20 years. The ancient hall stood on neutral ground between 3 pack territories land that had been designated in the original law as belonging to the court itself, not to any crown, which meant that no king's military authority extended to its doors. Marcus sent soldiers to stand at the outer perimeter. He was entitled to do that. He was not entitled to move them inside, and he knew it. And the knowledge showed in the way he held his posture when the gallery filled. And he could not thin the crowd by commanding his guards to discourage entry. Eveline entered in the dark morning gray of a formal petitioner. She was not performing humility. She was performing the specific role the court's protocols required of someone making a claim against a sitting crown. Cassian walked 1 step behind her, as her law representative, not in front of her. Rowan entered with the witness circle around her. 6 people, 2 from each of 3 different packs, who had agreed to stand in the space that usually left a witness isolated and exposed. Seraphine entered last. She was still wearing the crown. The gallery did not know what to make of that. They were about to find out. The proceedings began with the 3-part structure that neutral moon court law required for succession disputes. The first question was blood. Eveline presented the birthing cloth and its royal scent. She presented Rowan's testimony, which the old woman gave in a voice that shook at the beginning and steadied as it continued, describing with precise detail the night of the Queen's death and what had happened in that room before the temple clerk arrived. She presented the half-ledger and the temple seal fragment recovered from Mael's hand and the partial document that had survived the fire. Marcus's legal representative challenged every piece. The birthing cloth scent could have been manufactured. Rowan was an aged woman, whose memory had been 20 years unverified. The burned document was incomplete and had spent time in uncontrolled conditions. Cassian requested the Moonstone test. It was an ancient verification, one of the few supernatural mechanisms that the court recognized as evidence because it had been used for this purpose since the law was written. Royal Bloodline responded to the stone in a documented way. A line of silver, a warmth that had been described in the same terms by every observer who had recorded it. Eveline placed her wrist against the stone. The reaction was immediate. Then Seraphine was asked to do the same. She walked to the stone slowly, and she placed her wrist against it, and she held it there for the full required count. Nothing. The gallery was very quiet. The second question was record. Eveline presented the full temple ledger, reconstructed from Mael's partial original, the copy held by a Ravenscar scholar, who had received it from an independent temple clerk 3 years earlier, and the 3 other copies held in the Witness Circle's network. She presented the evidence of Morkant's alteration, the messenger's written account of how he had been approached and what he had been paid, the seal records showing Morkant's office had issued a seal of the type found in Mael's hand, the death record for Mael himself, and the records that showed who had authorized the investigation that had been closed within 24 hours. Morkant, who had not expected to be named directly, sat very still. His representative argued that uncertified archive copies were not admissible. Cassian replied that the Neutral Moon Court Charter specifically addressed the question of archive admissibility when the archive itself was under investigation, and that the answer the charter gave was independent copies with multiple corroborating witnesses were exactly the kind of evidence that the court existed to hear. The third question was authority. Eveline presented the pack oath records that showed the ceremony conditions under which Ravenscar and 6 other packs had sworn loyalty conditions that included financial duress, military presence, and, in 3 cases, explicit documentation of threats made before the ceremony. She presented the timeline of Marcus's regency, the legal window that had been defined in the original succession documents, and the years beyond it, during which he had continued to rule without the legal transfer of authority that the crown law required. She presented the record of Seraphine's investiture, and the documents that showed it had been prepared as a contingency measure years before the public ceremony. Marcus stood and told the court that Eveline had been manufactured by Ravenscar for political purposes. He said the Bloodmark test was unreliable. He said Rowan was a frightened old woman who had been given a story and coached to repeat it. He said that Ravenscar had a documented history of opposing his administration and should be considered a hostile witness source. He said, a mark can be staged, a witness can be bought. A border pack can manufacture a queen as easily as a rebel flag. You are not looking at a claimant. You are looking at a weapon someone built and handed to a girl who was angry enough to carry it. He was articulate. He was precise. He was, in another court, in another context, making arguments that would have needed answering. In this court, on this day, Seraphine stood up. She did not move immediately. She sat for a moment with her hands in her lap, and the court watched her, and she looked at the crown, the way a person looks at something they have been told. Their whole life was theirs, and our only now understanding was never given freely. It was heavier than she had expected when she finally lifted it. She had worn it for months, and never noticed the weight until this moment, when she was deciding what to do with it instead of simply wearing it. She removed it from her head. She held it at arm's length. It was not a crown anymore. It was evidence. She placed it on the petitioner's table. She said, "I was raised to be a crown. I was never told I was also a lock." She turned to face the court and gave her testimony, not about Eveline's claim, which she could not verify, but about the documents she had found, the irregularities. The servants dismissed without record, the letter in Marcus's hand, the dates that did not agree. She said she had been given a role that required her not to ask certain questions. She said she had finally asked them. Marcus stood and ordered her to sit down. She did not. Then he did what Eveline had been waiting for him to do. He ordered his soldiers, who were standing outside but who could hear the proceedings, to enter and arrest Eveline for conspiracy against the crown. The doors did not open. Naren's voice came from beyond them. And then, one by one, 7 alphas spoke the formal withdrawal, the specific language of the oath reversal that the Crown Oath Law described, which required only that they speak it before witnesses in a legal venue. In the gallery, people who had not previously understood what they were hearing began to understand. A general pushed through the door, not with weapons. He came to the platform where Marcus stood and said, "My king, I cannot enforce a command the law no longer recognizes." Marcus looked at Eveline. She was watching him, not with triumph. With the specific attention of someone who has been waiting a long time and is finally watching a thing resolve, he said. "You came to take my throne," she said. "No, I came to prove it was never yours." The court's verdict was not delivered in a single sentence. Neutral Moon Court procedure required formal findings, and Cassian had spent 3 weeks ensuring that every finding was framed in language that addressed not just Marcus's specific crimes, but the mechanisms by which those crimes had been possible. The formal record documented concealment of the lawful heir, alteration of succession documents, compelled oath ceremonies, unlawful extension of regency authority, and creation of a false succession to perpetuate that authority. Marcus was stripped of the Alpha crown. He was remanded to a neutral fortress pending a separate tribunal, because Eveline had made clear to the court that she would not accept a system where the victor of a succession dispute also presided over the punishment of the person she had defeated. That was one of the things she had understood from Mael, that the structures she built needed to hold when she was wrong as much as when she was right. Morcant was arrested on the court floor because the evidence of the messenger bribery and the seal record were sufficient for an immediate finding of criminal record interference. The alteration of Mael's official death record from its true cause was its own finding. Eveline watched Marcus leave the hall under escort. She had imagined this moment for most of the past year. She had imagined feeling the thing that people in the stories felt when justice arrived. The clean relief, the sense of a weight lifting, the satisfaction of a debt finally paid. What she actually felt was something smaller and more complicated and more honest. Mael was not alive. He had died in a dark room because she had moved him like a piece on a map without thinking carefully enough about what pieces were made of. Rowan had not received the 20 years she had spent afraid, carrying half a truth and not knowing if the half she had was enough. Seraphine had not been given a childhood that was hers. She had been given a function and taught to love it. And Eveline herself could not reclaim the life she might have lived in the palace. She had never been permitted to inhabit. A victory was not a restoration. It was only the opening of a different kind of work. The crown on the table was not a prize. It was a question she was about to have to answer. The pack representatives who had gathered for the court's verdict assembled again 2 days later, when Eveline was recognized by formal acclamation as the lawful heir of Aurelthorn. By protocol, the next step was the crown oath ceremony. The Pax would swear, she would accept, and the authority that had been held by Marcus would transfer to her. She had thought about this for a long time. She asked for silence. She said that she had come to Aurelthorn to prove something was false. She had not come to pick up exactly what she had found and wear it the same way. She said that the crown oath, as it was written, gave the wearer of the crown more unchecked authority than any single person should be trusted with. That she knew this because she had seen what Marcus had done with it, and that she was not confident she would do better with the same tool. She told the assembly that she was willing to accept the crown under a different charter. She had been carrying a question with her since Ravenscar, a question an Alpha had asked her when she had been laying out the case for why the Pax should stand with her. He had asked, if they put her on the throne, how would they know she would not hide the law the way Marcus had? She had not answered him then. She was answering him now. She read the Open Crown Charter herself, in the hall, without ceremony. Royal Archive open to Pack auditors. Succession records held in multiple independent locations. Neutral Moon Court available on petition, not at Crown discretion. Pack oaths sworn to the lawful Crown and the Charter, not to any individual. The Crown could not exile a claimant or a witness without tribunal. Witness circle recognized as an independent protective body. Pack assembly with formal authority to delay Crown military orders pending review. Royal authority subject to formal audit every 5 years. Cassian asked her, quietly, afterward, whether she understood what she had given up. She said, if I need absolute power to keep the crown, then Marcus taught me nothing except how to become him. He said, you won the throne today, and then you made it less dangerous. Eveline said, that is the only reason I can bear to sit on it. Seraphine was not punished in the way that some in the assembly had called for. Eveline stood before the court and said that Seraphine had been placed in her role before she could choose it, and that the moment she had chosen differently, she had done so at personal cost. She said that this did not erase the benefit Seraphine had received from occupying a throne that was not hers. She said the appropriate response was Seraphine's testimony in Marcus's tribunal and her formal renunciation of any succession claim. Seraphine did both. She left the capital with her given name and no title and a freedom she had not had before, which was a smaller thing than it might sound, and also, in its own way, not nothing. Rowan was given formal protection under the new Witness Circle Charter and public recognition in the court record. She said she had kept only half the truth for 20 years and had been afraid the half she kept was not enough. Eveline told her it had been enough to build on. The old woman did not stop crying for a while after that, and Eveline sat with her and did not try to make it stop. A year later, the Royal Archive's first independent audit was scheduled. Pack Assembly had been convened 6 times. Neutral Moon Court had heard 2 petitions, one about a disputed pack boundary, one about a tribute agreement from the Marcus years that one pack claimed had been signed under duress. Both had been heard. One had been decided in the petitioning pack's favor. One had not. On the day of the first formal pack assembly session, in the new charter's 2nd year, there was a tax dispute about the eastern border territories. Eveline made her position clear. The assembly made a different decision. The people in the room waited. They had not yet been in a situation where the Crown had lost a vote, and they did not know how the Crown would respond. Eveline said she wanted the full session notes entered in the archive. She said the assembly's finding would stand. She said she would submit a formal objection through the proper channels if she wished to revisit the question. Then she sat down. Later, in the outer courtyard, a child had found Rowan sitting on a bench in the autumn sun and asked her why the queen would let other people say no to her. Rowan said, "Because the last king did not." The child thought about this. It was not a complete answer. Nothing about what had happened in Aurelthorn over the past year was a complete answer, because the questions were not the kind that resolved into clean conclusions. But it was an honest one, and in a kingdom that had been built on the systematic falsification of the record, honesty in small things was where everything else had to start. Eveline had returned to end Marcus's reign, but her true victory was not taking the crown from his head. It was making sure no crown could ever hide the law beneath it again.